It is. It's very different. Right. Let me just see. I have. I'll give them out later. Yeah. All done. I did that this morning while it was in my head. Well, today it's just a brief dip in, really, at self-portraiture, and I'm trying to go back as far as I could, and I'm fairly modern-ish, 2005. I'm fairly modern. Yeah. So what's interesting, really, about portraiture or self-portraits is really what makes a good portrait or self-portrait. What makes somebody identifiable? You know, if you've watched Portrait Artist of the Year or something, what is it that makes someone look like someone? Is it the shape of the head? Is it the eyes? Is it a combination of things? Is there a certain thing that you look for, you know, that makes it recognizable? Because obviously what's really interesting with self-portraiture is that up until 1850, with no actual clue what these artists did look like, because cameras weren't invented, so we've only got their self-portraits to give us any indication, and they could have been more flattering or not, you know. As was the case that we've looked at previously with royalty, you know, their portraits were there to indicate whatever they wanted to portray themselves as: powerful, wealthy, you know, firm. Well, this is it. Well, you know, when you think about it, apart from yeah. So, yes. So I think, you know, when you think back then, with terms of royalty, the only way the general public would know what their monarch looked like would be official portraits and currency. You know, so, you know, it's slightly different for us, isn't it? Because, you know, you've got social media and you've got, you know, the royal family have got their own Facebook page and all of that, and you'll see photographs in newspapers and on.
You know, when you see some people like actors and they're on the red carpet and they've done that, and then you see a picture of them with no makeup, really different.
Absolutely.
They still might necessarily know. Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah, it is. That's very true. What is the real them? And if they were having a portrait painted, or indeed painting a portrait of themselves, it's how they want to be seen, isn't it? That's the important part. It's what they want to portray. Oh yes. Yeah.
And then obviously they're choosing the clothes that they want to wear.
Yes.
They choose how they want to sit.
Yes.
So it's all those things, isn't it?
Absolutely.
That go towards making the portrait. Yes, and who you are. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. If it's something that very well, or you know, been a fan of years, or you know, all that.
Yeah. And then you get those just 4 hours to get a bit of personality in it. I mean, even with the pet portraits, I've got one that I've got start of a someone's dog up north that's passed away, and I have to say, what was the dog like? What was the dog's personality? Because naughty, yeah, because you kind of have to try and convey that if you can, to get, you know, to get that emotional side across. So, you know, a self-portrait is really tricky.
It is, because only you really know what's going on in your mind. So sort of portray that on a picture.
Absolutely. And also, the interesting thing is you will be looking at yourself. Modern day, you don't need to. Jackie could take a photograph of me, and that's fine. But if you're in back here, you're looking in a mirror, so you're reversed, aren't you? So technically what we should do is look at a self-portrait in the mirror or flip it, so we get what they actually look like. Because if you're into mobile phones or anything, and you take a selfie with the reverse camera, and then someone takes a photograph of you with the front facing camera, you do look quite different flipped. You say, I struggle. I don't often know what I look like, because I'm often on camera, but I'm always backwards. Which is, yeah. Yeah.
And the thing is, when you're doing the self-portrait, it's the eyes can't really concentrate.
No, you can't concentrate on the eyes, because as soon as you're looking at the eyes, the minute you go to paint, you're not looking at the eyes. So there's a lot to portray. No, exactly. So if you were in just if you think for a minute, the actual art of doing a self-portrait, I have never done it from a mirror. I've only ever done it from a printout of me. If you think you've got your canvas to the right of you if you're right-handed, then you've got a mirror to the left of you at that point, and every time you turn your head to look at you in the mirror, you've then got to try and portray that there on the canvas. Or do you not turn your head, you get in the pose that you want and limit your movement, so you're just glancing at the mirror. Exactly, and there is so many subtle movements that if I just move my head an inch, I've got a totally different look and angle. So it's a massive skill just to do a self-portrait. And I don't think we give that enough credit. And it's not until you actually attempt to do it, even from a printout, it's hard. But from, when mirrors were invented, lenses in the 1400s, there weren't even great mirrors back then. Or even shiny copper or something. That there's going to be a bit of distortion. Well, it is. However, when you're a jobbing artist, you can't afford to pay for a model. So you are your model, and that shows. Yes, so that would always stay. That would be, this is how I do self-portraits, and this is how I paint portraits. And if you can get it to look like you, then they'll book you, because they know you've done a good job. So it's kind of like your portfolio. But it's fascinating. But I did look up while I was researching. We're gonna try and look at 30 if we can. Just a brief look at them. Not generic art history kind of stuff. And I wanted to know what the first self-portrait was. And there are two. There's the first self-portrait as we would recognise it in paint form, and then there is the first self-portrait ever. And the first self-portrait ever is this. And it's by Bach with his wife Taheri. So it's Egyptian. And this is one of the earliest surviving self-portraits from antiquity, as Bach, the chief sculptor to the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten. And it's beautifully preserved in Berlin, and it's, it's wonderful, isn't it? Ridiculously old, absolutely. And it's quite fascinating, really, because giving himself no, but maybe that's a sign of a good sculptor and portrait artist, really. I mean, maybe he's been more flattering with his wife than himself. But Akhenaten, he actually reformed Egyptians' religion by making the sun, Aten, the sole deity and creator of all things. So he got rid of all of the multiple gods and even the need for priests at that time. So he's quite a whirlwind in ancient Egypt. And in the surviving sculpture of the period, he, Akhenaten, is the sole link between God and his people. So you're reducing all of the other things and just making it about that. Yeah, like a prophet-like figure. Oh, absolutely. The state of human perfection, really. So it's quite fascinating. So yeah, the sculptor of Akhenaten had to do himself. It isn't it? Yeah. I don't know. It took me ages to actually find. I was reading up about it in loads of sites, but it's really hard to find anything about it. But I'm going to have a quick look. But you know what's very interesting about it is Egyptian and it's ancient Egyptian, but they're not following any Egyptian art rules. They're not side on. No, exactly. Which is really interesting, isn't it? It's sort of, let's see if I can find out on, sometimes just a different search engine makes a difference.
I mean, they just look.
See if I can find. Well, I can find. There's so much information about it, but yeah, because it is the first selfie. You know what I mean? In the modern world, what was the first selfie?
It looks like on the mantelpiece. It's a picture of a mum and dad. No, it's like just have it.
No. Yeah, I imagine I wouldn't have thought it was much bigger than A3 or something like that, you know, that sort of size, just because of the writing in it. But I mean, he was a skilled sculptor. Maybe Jack could, if you could find out for us.
The size.
That. So yeah, this is the first self-portrait as a self-portrait, you know, that's recorded. There might have been others, because if you, when you remember when we did ancient Egypt and we looked at an ancient Rome and we looked at the sarcophagus and stuff, obviously that was done by someone else, so it's not a selfie. But here we've got a sculptor to the pharaoh who's done his own sculpture of himself.
You might get something that they've done the picture of themselves, they actually haven't noticed it down as themselves, they just have like an unknown man.
Absolutely, yeah, exactly, yeah.
Of course, you could do a mould of yourself.
You could, absolutely, like almost like a death mask kind of thing, but alive. Yeah, I've actually done that when I was a teenager. However, I did it very wrong and it could have scarred me for life, because I was very into theatrical makeup and stuff, and I did a cast of my face with my mum's help, but we didn't read up on it pre-internet. And you should use alginate, which is the stuff that dentists use to make a mould of your mouth. We just use straight plaster of Paris, which heats up phenomenally, and it can cause third-degree burns. I was extremely lucky that we applied the plaster of Paris straight to your face with 2 straws up my nose. And I can remember doing this because I got so hot. But yeah, that's why they say with like doing moulds of kids' hands, you have to use the alginate, because some people using just dipping them in plaster of Paris and it's burning children's hands. So because the reaction in the lime plaster gets hot because it dries within seconds, and it's heat that does it. So that's something else. So if we move on a little bit, we get this, an illuminated manuscript of St. Dunstan. Now, he was then the artist abbot of Glastonbury, and he is here. So this is the self-portrait. Here, this is Christ. So the abbot of Glastonbury is prostrating himself at the feet of Christ. I don't know if I can't zoom in really. But isn't that really interesting? Oh,
Yes, it's almost comical though, isn't it?
it is, absolutely. And what is inscribed there that you can just make out says, "Remember, I beg you, merciful Christ, to protect Dunstan and do not permit the storms of the underworld to swallow me up." So it's like a petition and a plea of yeah.
Isn't it, kind of?
Mm.
Yes.
Well, maybe it was a thing of about Christ, but then he suffered some hardships or troubles, and then he thought he'd add that in. So this was done in 950. It has been cropped. I couldn't get the full image. But later, Saint Dunstan, obviously he wasn't a saint back then. He became the Archbishop of Canterbury. So isn't that fascinating? What a medieval kind of selfie. But this actually is really interesting because, in terms of portraiture, up until the dissolution of the monastery, which is Henry VIII, that's Cafe Bell. Up until the dissolution of the monastery, most artwork was all about reverence of Christ. You know, it was all religious. And what happened around the time of the Wilton diptych, you might have heard or seen of that, that was a sneaky footing in of having a portrait done. Because the king, I can't remember which king it was King Richard, had himself on one panel, surrounded by saints, worshipping Jesus and Mary. So they kind of snuck it in a little bit so they could have a portrait looking quite religious with a religious theme. But with the dissolution of the monastery, that kind of, and the change of the religion and all of this kind of stuff, meant that merchants and wealthy people, it was okay to have normal portraits done. But this is way, way earlier than any of that. So he has snuck himself in. I mean, he's made himself small, so it's not irreverent, you know. No. It looks quite big to you. So, what, that sort of size? So about 2 foot by 1 foot? Can't find the size. We ought to get all these people to put little coins the side of it for reference, or a hand. Tomato. Yes. A beef tomato. They're massive, aren't they? Or a cherry. Yeah. Or yes, I don't know if that's a hole. That might be a hole. I think it's his ribbon. And then a hole. Yeah, his sash. And then I think that might be a hole with a black thing. So yeah, this is like one of the earliest drawn self-portraits. Which is quite cool, isn't it? Because you don't notice it at first. You just look at the big Jesus. Yeah. No, there he is. And there we have Edwine the scribe in the 1150s. Another selfie. And what is with an inscription on the next page, and it says, "I am the chief of scribes, and neither my praise nor fame shall die. Shout out, O my letter, who I may be. By its fame your script proclaims you, Edwine, whom the painted figure represents, alive through the ages, whose genius the beauty of this book demonstrates. Receive, O God, the book and its donor as an acceptable gift." He was. Do you know what? What's really interesting is how forward-thinking that is. He realised that if he could draw himself within the manuscript, he would live on in some form. You know? That's because a lot of artists don't really ever give that huge amount. You know, there are some artists that will, but mainstream artists, you don't think. I've never painted with the aim of that piece lasting 500, 600, 700 years. I'm not really bothered about that. But clearly, Edwine was. He really wanted to be remembered. And, he has been, hasn't he? Because we're talking about him in 2023. How many years ago was that, from the 1150s? A long time ago. You know what? I'm not sure. Edwine the Scribe, but I think it's in Canterbury, or was in Canterbury at some point. So yeah, those are the oldest selfies, or the oldest self-portraits as such, which is quite fascinating, really, to be done in that sort of ancient style. It is what it is. Made in Canterbury, and where is it? Oh, Trinity College, Cambridge has it. Edwine the Big Head. The Wren Library, thanks, Jackie. They are beautiful, they really are. It is very much of its time. And, this would be on vellum, because we didn't really have paper then. But it's fascinating and beautiful, isn't it? And it's him doing his work, but that inscription is quite something, isn't it, about who he is and what he wants, and my praise nor fame shall die. Well, he's both-handed, yeah, he's got a quill in one hand, and I don't know what the other tool is on the other. But what's really interesting, when we've looked at scribes previously, a lot of them, they do it on their lap. Haven't they? We've seen some where they've got a footstool and their knees up. I always imagine them working at a table or like in a little cell, but no manuscripts ever show that to be the case, which is quite fascinating. But here I can't even tell what it's on. It's on something draped in some stand draped in fabric, but it's got a bit of perspective in that book. The chair doesn't look very comfortable. But yeah, it's just fascinating that this guy, so forward-thinking, that he wanted his name to live on, because we don't often know. I think even in the Lindisfarne Gospels, we kind of know, we've got names of people who did what, because it was a conveyor belt. So some wrote, some illustrated, some bound, bound the books. But we wouldn't know what they looked like. But here, we know exactly what Edwine the Scribe looked like, which I just find that really fascinating. I really do. So the actual earliest painted self-portrait that we would consider a true self-portrait is this one by Albrecht Dürer, painted in 1500 in oils on wooden panel. Albrecht Dürer, I think, was one of the most skilled artists ever, and he used whatever technology was available to him to do his job. He would use the grid method, he would use lenses. I think he did a beautiful clump of earth and grasses, but he actually dug it up and brought it into the studio so he could paint it from life rather than from memory. But yeah, how skillful is that? Would you know he was an artist? Yeah, no. And that's what's really interesting to look at. And remember what we said at the beginning, that, for a jobbing artist, the self-portrait was the way of having something to show your skills. So maybe he didn't want to show himself as an artist because he wasn't going to be painting artists, he was going to be painting people, a normal person. But he does quite, doesn't he? Or some sort of, with the fur, and, he looks almost regal in some respects, like a Norse chieftain. And absolutely, I mean, he doesn't look that old, really. Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, to be honest, technically, this is not the first self-portrait by Albrecht Dürer. He was 13 when he drew his first self-portrait. But then this is he's holding a thistle, and no, this isn't the one where he's holding a thistle. It is. He did loads of self-portraits in his early 20s, and then at this one he was aged 28. Very confident, and you know, this is where he was in his height of his career. He was really well known. Yeah. You know, oh, not mathematically. 56. So yeah, it is middle age, really, at 28. So yeah, we've got, he's pulling his coat close here, and the hand gesture is that of Christ's blessing. So he feels blessed for being at the height of his career, really. It's equal parts striking, complex, and it's quite captivating, isn't it? So yeah, this is believed to be the first painted self-portrait. Oh, absolutely. It's very Game of Thrones, isn't it? You know, it's got that feel to it. I think it's really, really lovely. Yeah, and you almost wonder their voice, you know what I mean? Can you can always hear their voice, can't you? And then it makes you... No. They have made a pharaoh's voice. Yes, they did a digital print of the voice box and larynx of a pharaoh, and they did a digital scan and a 3D print of it, and they made one sound through it like a moan, just to hear the tones. Fascinating. Fascinating. I suppose if they've got a decent preserved vocal cords and all that, yeah, absolutely. But it is beautiful. I mean, for the first ever self-portrait. Now, whether Albrecht Dürer wouldn't know that was the first ever self-portrait in painted, because you wouldn't know what was going on in the rest of the world, would you? You'd think other artists would be doing similar things. Yeah, absolutely. So it's quite magical in a way. And it is very striking, and I think having that really dark background. And I think based on that, if he did look like that, you'd get more work. So he must look like that. Which is interesting. If you notice, his eyes are looking off. So that would be looking towards the mirror. Because a very skilled artist, you know, like you're using a computer mouse. Some computer people who are skilled can use a computer mouse to trace whilst drawing. Like I could, you know, use without looking at my mouse, I can draw around, you know, that kind of thing. And it's the same as touch typists and all of that. So he could be skilled enough, because he was such an amazing artist, that he could keep his eyes on the mirror and draw what he's looking at without taking his eyes off the mirror, and then just get the basics in and then sketch. You know, huge skill. Let's move on and have a look at this one. Ooh, yeah. They do. I've worked out the formula. You need one eye facing you directly and one eye slightly out, not in. If one is slightly out and one is central, wherever you go, the eyes follow you. It's quite an exciting thing, really, to try and get. So this is obviously very old, from 1512, and it is red chalk on paper, and it is by Da Vinci. It's a very rare self-portrait. There's not a lot of work by Da Vinci that survives, you know. He would have been 60-ish at that time. Absolutely, but also the thing is, when you're an artist and you're having to mix your own pigments, some of them are extremely toxic. You know, you've got lead-based paint, you've got just some of the pigments that you're breathing in by moving them around. It's and Jackie's been making some watercolors, aren't you? And you can contest at how the pigment just goes everywhere. You know, and at various points in history, you could tell an artist how we would tell somebody who's got a long history with drug addiction. They would have very sunken cheeks. They would be very dark under their eyes, very pale complexion, because a lot of them are stuck inside all the time and they're mixing these toxic fumes. So yeah, I mean, it looks like one of those old men masks that you can get in the fancy dress shop, doesn't it?
But of course, he was also doing all
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. So yeah, this is a 60-year-old Da Vinci. He didn't. Why, mate? Yes, he didn't really think of doing one earlier, but no. Oh, he was doing all of his inventions and everything as well, wasn't he? He was a very busy man. But it does make you feel when you look at these, because we don't always look at self-portraits when we talk about artists. It makes them feel more human, doesn't it? Because sometimes when you hear Da Vinci, you often just think of their own paintings. So you'll think of like the Mona Lisa and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. So you're separating the artist from their work. Whereas if you can imagine what they look like, you could almost imagine this old guy with a brush, getting his paint in his easel, and it's caught in his palette probably, with his beard, just trailing in his paint by accident, having to tuck it in his tunic or something. You know, you have to try and make it feel human. Now, this portrait, I think, is amazing. Oh, hang on, let's get that. Absolutely amazing, and it's by Parmigianino or something like that. And it's a self-portrait using a convex mirror, but the panel is also convex to give it that feel. Because when you think 1524, lenses and mirrors had been around for a while, but they weren't the same sort of thing as they are now. So it's the equivalent of a fisheye lens, I suppose, because it bulges out. You know, like the ones in shops where you've got or on roads where the mirror's in the corner of the room. They bow a little, they're convex, so you can see round corners and things. So that's the kind of mirror that he's using. Parmigianino. Yes. And I thought it was a woman. He looks very feminine. Yeah, so no, I'd never seen that, and I'd never heard of Parmigianino because we've never done him. I've done Italian artists, but I don't think I've done him. But it's interesting because you've got all the distortions perfectly done. Look how curved that window is, and the beams and the ceiling, and his hand moves in a different way. You know, and his hand is huge because it's looking in a mirror. Absolutely. So the focus, he does look very young. He was 21 at the time. So obviously, elongated hand because of the mirror. But yeah, it was a specially prepared convex panel to mimic the way it looked to him. That would also not be easy to do. A panel that curved. Yeah, no, and it would almost be easier to carve a concave one because you're carving in, aren't you? But this time you've got to be, you've got to sculpt it almost. Yeah. So how innovative was that? No.
Every time that moves, he's got to try and get that back again. You can't even imagine it.
No. So that would be his left hand, wouldn't it? Would it be his left hand? Right hand. So maybe he was a left-handed artist. Yeah. Well, yes, actually, yeah, because his easel might be that. You see that edge there, the panel, because it is bowing slightly. Maybe that's the panel that he's drawing on, or maybe he drew it and then transferred. Because, like with Da Vinci, how he transferred the Mona Lisa, he sketched the Mona Lisa on paper, and then he did what dressmakers do with the pinprick method. So you draw it and then you'd work from your drawing, and I think this is what maybe he would have done, because it would have been hard to transfer this straight onto a wooden panel. So yeah, he would be left-handed. He'd have his right hand leaning like that, and then he'd be working like that. Yeah, it's fascinating. Have you ever seen this one before? Beautiful, isn't it? And you know, the detail in the clothing and everything, it's just so, it is, it's beautiful. It really struck me, you know, we've seen, I think they're called tondos when they're round, or roundels, but I like a nice tondo because it sounds good. You've seen them before, but what makes it really striking is that you suddenly realise that it's not straight, or everything's curved. It is like a fisheye, like you're looking at something through somebody else's eyes almost. An unusual choice, you know, at a time when self-portraits, you know, they wouldn't be 10 a penny, but he's then going one step further to make it more interesting and maybe more challenging as well, because you've got to make it curved. Because, you know, if you look at yourself in the back of a spoon, you know, so maybe he found that this, with his arm forward and his head back, didn't distort his face much. Whereas if he'd leant forward, everything would have been distorted. So it's absolutely fascinating. Maybe, absolutely. And then thought, you know what, that's a really good idea. Why don't I try? Absolutely, yeah. That's the thing, you know, on Portrait Artist of the Year, they go, what we're looking for is for something that we're not seen before. Well, that's getting harder and harder, because when we did you do the ancient Greek and Roman one? We were looking at stuff there, like that chariot in a tomb was drawn in like full chiaroscuro 1,000 years before Michelangelo was doing chiaroscuro. So it just shows that there's nothing new, that it's everything has been done. It's the same as music, isn't it? You know, there are only so many notes in so many ways you can arrange them. There are going to be accidental times when you think you've discovered a new sound, and actually it's something that was from 200 years ago. So this is Sofonisba Anguissola, 1556. She is an Italian Renaissance painter, to a fairly poor but noble family. She had a very well-rounded education, and she had an apprenticeship for local painters, and that set a precedent for women to be accepted as students of art, so they could work as artists. So Sofonisba Anguissola was one of the most influential female artists of the Renaissance. She did so much stuff. She actually, as a younger woman, she travelled to Rome, and she was introduced to Michelangelo, who was older than her. He instantly recognised her talent, and they used to write to each other, and he would give her challenges to paint or draw something, and then she would, like in the paper, fold the paper up, send it to Michelangelo, and he would grade it. You know, so it's almost like she had a correspondence school with Michelangelo. She went to Milan. She painted the Duke of Alba. She painted Elizabeth of Valois, and you know, she actually went and was recruited to be Elizabeth of Valois' art teacher. So she was teaching royalty. And then she became the official court painter to King Philip II of Spain, and adapted her style to more formal portraits of the Spanish court. And after the Queen's death, obviously she was her art teacher, King Philip II helped to arrange an aristocratic marriage for Sophonisba, and she moved to Sicily, then Pisa, then Genoa, and she continued to practice as a leading portrait painter. What's fascinating is that throughout history, a lot of these female artists, as we discuss, get painted out, literally. Whereas they were really highly influential and up there. And what is fascinating as well is that because of the social situation, females weren't really allowed to paint nudes, so they couldn't do Christ on the cross, you know, because they wouldn't be able to see what nude men look like. But that meant that they could hone their skills in other ways. So you'll find that the female artists became better portrait painters than their contemporaries, because, you know, while Michelangelo was up a scaffolding for decades doing the Sistine Chapel, which he hated because it was just such a long thing for him. He wanted to be doing sculpture and poetry and normal painting, not spend until you're in your 60s up a scaffolding. These female artists were doing groundbreaking stuff. Sophonisba Anguissola actually made one of my favourite paintings. I think it's called The Chess Game, and it's 3 siblings with a nursemaid, and they're all smiling and happy, which is really hard to do. Absolutely beautiful. So yeah, what a wonderful portrait painter. Now she obviously is showing a double skill, because she's showing a self-portrait as an artist painting a religious picture. Yeah. So how skillful is that? So we've got 2 paintings in one. And also how skillful, because the canvas that she's working on isn't her own self-portrait. So what she would have done is left that canvas blank while she was doing her own self-portrait, so she could then paint that painting afterwards. But that's not easy, because she's got a mahl stick in one hand. You know what a mahl stick is? So what happens with that is, if I'm right-handed, I lean that on the edge of the canvas, and that can go on the other edge of the canvas, so I can lean and I'm not getting filthy. Yeah. Yeah. So
I can't show you on the camera, but yeah, if
a mahl
so that
is there. Otherwise, you're going to get your sleeves all mucky. Yes, so
it's already behind because it's leaning on that canvas.
So she may have got somebody else to pose like that, because you couldn't do that and paint a picture at the same time. Yes, or her sister. But so you've got familial hounds, I suppose. But yeah, I'm trying to balance this out, where we've got a lot of female painters in this, because I think it's important to give them this, not because I know I'm going to do another female artist one, but I think, yeah, number 4, and I think it's important to recognise their role in everything and have them just alongside male contemporaries, as they would have been in work. You know, Sophonisba Anguissola was working at the same time as Michelangelo was working, and she was doing extremely well for herself. Oh, well, it takes a long time. It does take a long time to really put it all together. Right, here we go. This is called Young Sick Bacchus, but it is also a self-portrait of Caravaggio. And this is around 1593. Now, what's interesting is this was painted after Caravaggio was hospitalised for 6 months with probable malaria. And And he was quite an indulgent character, was Caravaggio, so he decided to portray himself as Bacchus, the god of wine. Again, this was not a commission. This would be a way of displaying your own skills to the patrons, really. Maybe. He's very poorly. Oh. So it's good, isn't it? I mean, he was a famous painter. He just looks like a sickly boy, but it is called Young Sick Bacchus for a reason, because of him being sick. And obviously, Caravaggio was a murderer, and he spent his life on the run, painting in different places. They do feel that they may have found where he was buried, because there was an ancient tale of where he was buried, and there is a burial grave there, and they've looked at it, and the bones had a high lead content, which you would expect from a painter, but also that would, if he did have a lot of lead in him, that would also affect his temperament and would have caused him to be the murderer, because he lashing out in anger. So there's a lot of interesting things to think about, really, with all of that. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's why mercury is a similar thing as well. I think lead and mercury in fillings, because there was a thing that if you had a lot of mercury in your mouth, it can affect your memory. Yes, I think Terry Pratchett, before his dementia and stuff set in, I think he got all of his metal mercury fillings removed and replaced with white fillings, which doesn't come cheap. Yes, I think I would like to do that, but I think I'm getting to the point where my teeth are that bad, I've got to just wear some, stick them in a gel. Yeah. No. So yeah, it's a gorgeous portrait though. I mean, if you look at just the grapes and that almost still life of peaches and grapes, this is still life within itself. The bloom on the grapes is just beautiful. But how do you do that as a self-portrait? Because you're sitting. What is he there? He's holding his grapes. Yeah. Like that, holding the grapes, you know, your arms like that, and then flexing, and then he's got his other hand that you can't see his arm because it's behind the fabric, but you can see a hint of the other hand, the other side of the grapes. So it's a beautiful portrait, but he is sickly, and I think he painted it too accurately, and then had to call it Young Sick Bacchus. There's something wrong, absolutely. Absolutely. Because I mean, it's not new. They would often get family. You know, if they've got an important portrait or scene to do, they would get family members, because they do it for free, to sit or pose in the costumes or whatever to get that right, so they could go and just spend little time with the sitter to get the face right. Because you don't think about all of this, but they had to try and pay for all of the models and everything themselves. I think that's honestly why a lot of artists end up having affairs with their models, because then they probably wouldn't have to pay them. It's more of a relationship, symbiotic relationship, they'd call that. It makes sense though, doesn't it? Yeah. Right, I'll do one more and then I'll see. Time is money. No, they don't. No, I mean, they will when you see celebrities and royalty, you will probably have a few hours with them, but that's making preliminary sketches, taking photographs of different angles and different lighting, and then you go away and you do it, and they don't see it until it's complete. But yeah, it's much easier that way, I suppose. Less pressure. So this is Anthony van Dyck, self-portrait with a sunflower.
It's very unusual.
Yeah, absolutely. It is, and they're pointing at the sunflower. Sort of, yeah. In 1632, you've got floriography that had been going on for a while. It wasn't as popular as it became later, and then it had a massive resurgence in the Victorian period, the language of flowers. Now, the sunflower is a symbolic of devotion and fidelity, and the reason for that is because it turns to follow the sun throughout the day. So, because it is faithful to the sun, which is why it's called the sunflower. It's the French name for sunflower is tournesol, because it turned to the sun. Girasol, or girasole in Italian. So the symbolism has been around since Van Dyck's time for that, and many of these symbolist books would have been available for Van Dyck at his, they were around at its time. The crown. It has been interpreted, this portrait, as a declaration of loyalty only to Charles I. Yeah, absolutely. But it's, I suppose I think it is to look more fancy and to show it off, maybe, because he was the chief painter in order to their majesties at the court of Charles I of England. And then he had huge success in the southern Netherlands and Italy, which catapulted his career as a royal painter, and he was the favourite of King Charles I. And long after his death in 1641, Van Dyck's commitment to capturing the resemblance of his subjects earned him power over the field of portraiture. His portrait approach developed into what's known as the late English phase, and this is kind of him after a very long career, because he was this was painted in 1632 to 33. We don't know exactly the time, because they would take a long time over them, because you'd have several paintings on the go because of there being working in oils, because you can't always go back to it until a layer has dried. So then what are you going to do while that's doing? I'm going to say, Sue, did you want a drink, or are you all right? Yeah, what do you want? A watermelon-y thing. Do you want a drink, or are you all right? Right, a watermelon-y thing.
When you have a jacket, autumn is autumn silk. Yes, silk satin. Yes, I think the colour is lovely. And also the white background, that's possible for things. Just make the sunflower in the office. I would want to it's be going and this is it. On the way there's something else, it's just a finish, hasn't got any sort of like figure. He's actually looking and saying, is that all right? Yes, yeah. my sister and my nieces, we have a competition of who can go last. Yes. And so my sister designed, she designed a little certificate and you have to have a prize. Have you ever won? No, I haven't. And my actually my niece, yes, she certainly does. I was at school, and then started showing, and then the kids take them home, and again they used to bring in photographs of how tall it got, and some of them came up to first floor windows. Really? Yes. I think it just depends on the variety. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Sort me and Jackie out.
Yeah, there's and something there, I don't know. Is that what you come for? Yes, I'm lovely. Like my mum. Last week, and she put no biscuits in. Oh, and the amount of time she moaned about the fact that she hadn't got biscuits, I was like, oh, this is they can get really hard. I did. I started to give you a terrible review on both you guys. No, we can't actually, did you? Yes. That's what we were discussing. The fact that you don't have biscuits at home, you're free with them going out. You have to make the most of it. Wait to be honest. You miss out. I'm a good guys first. Well, I remember that I saying that when I saw it. What I went through. There's the marks. Oh, so especially my specialties. Maybe I can stay with next time I go to the mum's, take me home. Take me home this year. Yeah, then I used to look on. And then she used to get him about the loop. So of course I was. I didn't I took my own with it makes a big difference. Yeah. And I noticed that with my daughter moving out. It's made a huge difference in that department. Yeah. I do take my own coffee when I go to my mum's. Oh, yeah. I'm not sure what coffee I like. Oh, custard creams.
Right, so we'll move on.
This side you've jacket's really nice as well, isn't it?
Gorgeous. You can see that satin sheen, can't you? Really lovely. Old Van Dyke. No relation to Dick. Artemisia Gentileschi. Born in Rome, 1593. Well, this is an interesting one. She actually used to paint herself in her scenes a lot, but fascinating lady, really. Her father was also a well-known artist, and she trained in his workshop for a lot of years. Now, sadly, she was raped by an older member of the workshop, Agostino Tassi, and that actually shaped the rest of her life and her career. There was a court case and all of this kind of stuff. It was a really big, high-profile thing. But what happens? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was, and I think it was because her father was such an influential artist, and she wouldn't have made something like that up. But there was a court case, and I think Agostino had to be banished for a while, gone away. But what happened was the way she dealt with it was that all of her art featured powerful women, like Judith chopping off the head of Holofernes, and one, was it Dinah that put a tent peg through the head of another man, and so they're quite graphic but really strong women characters, and I think that's how she got through the trauma of the assault, was by only painting strong women. Yes, yeah, absolutely. And do you know, it made me think of Tracy Emin, because she's exactly the same thing, because of the way she was sexually assaulted when she was younger, and art became her therapy and her expression. So yeah, it's amazing, really. Yes, Salome with the head of John the Baptist was another one of hers. So basically, any sort of biblical or anything that was written back then about strong women, she then transferred it. Yes. No, it would have been easier to just shut up. Absolutely, I think so. And I think she was quite young at the time, like 15, 16, something like that. And it was an older man, and I think that was, a really big thing. But yeah, I mean, really, abstract concepts like painting were traditionally represented by female allegorical figures, and therefore the painting like this was not one that any male painter could present in the same way as both self-portrait and allegory. So that's where it's a double thing, a female portrait. So this portrait that we're looking at was influenced by the works of Cesare Ripa, where he suggests how virtues and abstract concepts should be depicted with human qualities and appearances. He said, painting should be shown as a beautiful woman with full black hair, dishevelled and twisted in various ways, with arched eyebrows that show imaginative thought, mouth covered with cloth tied behind her ears, and with a chain of gold at her throat from which hangs a mask, and has written in front imitation. She holds her hand a brush, and in the other a palette, with clothes of evanescently covered drapery. So other than the cloth tied around her mouth, gentilely, she actually follows that prescription quite accurately. So she's actually used herself as an allegory of an artist. So she's depicting herself as an artist. She was an artist, and it's a self-portrait at the same time. That's quite clever, really. The composition kind of mirrors two other artworks at the time, with diagonal lines to flaunt her figure, with her arm leaning up, so you can see her shape and her bust. And emphasises movement towards the canvas and towards us, because she's got one arm towards us, one arm away from us towards the canvas where she's painting. We can't see necessarily what she's painting. The light is coming from the left and is quite bright. Beautifully lit body, but her back very dark and obscure. It's gorgeous, isn't it? Yeah.
She's not hiding herself away, is she?
No, she's determined, and I think you can see the determination on her face as well. And there's a lot of self-portraits with Gentileschi where she's showing herself as a lute player, and all of these sort of things. She's a very strong woman. Obviously, the colour is interesting. With the lighting, you've got your lights and your darks. You can see actually behind there, where her head is dark, this is actually quite light. so it makes the heads come forward. Whereas if it followed really dark, the head would disappear into the darks. She is wearing a gold chain around her neck, as the description previously said. It's gorgeous, isn't it? Now, would she have painted in those clothes normally? No. Too fancy to paint in oils. But, you know, absolutely.
Well, I don't know, because you might have to look pretty smart, because if you have people coming into the studio.
Well, you need to look professional, I suppose, don't you? Yeah. Now, this painting was considered unfinished, but in 1972 they did some cleaning to it and removed overpainting to restore it to its earlier condition. And her initials are placed below the palette in the cleaned version. Yeah, absolutely. So yes, while being female during the Baroque era was quite negative in terms of rights and lifestyle, she found that being able to paint herself in this form worked really, really well. So it's quite fascinating, really. She absolutely. It's a very different thing altogether. Now, I'm just going to show you this one because it's quite fascinating, because it shows you how it was done. Johannes Gump, an Austrian painter, and this self-portrait shows him looking into a mirror whilst painting himself. So you've got three self-portraits because you're looking at him from the back. And it's, well, yeah, you've got the back view, which you never see in a self-portrait, and the mirrored view with what he really looked like, and then the painted view of his painting. But obviously, they're all painted. Isn't that clever? It is. It makes you wonder, how did he do this? He must have had somebody standing, painting, or pretending to paint, because it's not a self-portrait, is it? We're seeing him from the back. So he would have had somebody to model, and then he would have done his self-portrait twice, kind of thing. Because you couldn't have seen him from the back. You couldn't have seen himself from the back in the mirror and the canvas. Ooh.
I expect that to have quite a long time to produce them.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot going on in this picture, and this is in the Uffizi. Are you finding this interesting so far? It's just a good way of like seeing how people see themselves and why they see themselves and why they've got the need to do it. Obviously, we've seen for many, it's just a cheap way of promoting what you do. But for Rembrandt, it's really interesting as well, because this is 1634 Rembrandt. He was 30, very wealthy, an air of grandeur. Doesn't look like an artist. He looks like a sitter. Again, to show, to patrons and stuff of his skill. But the whole Rembrandt story is quite interesting and sad in a way. He's married to a very wealthy woman, and she died with the clause that he could keep the estate and the big house and everything as long as he never remarried. If he remarried, he would lose it all. However, he did have a relationship with the nursemaid of he and his late wife's child. That was quite a big thing, because she would have to agree to just knock about with him, and that would ruin her, her standing in the community, because she knew if she married him, she would be the cause of everything, and he would possibly remind her that often. They then had a child. So a 17-year-old nursemaid came to look after, and Rembrandt quite fancied her as an older man. So he wanted to have an affair with the new nursemaid. However, Mistress number one didn't like it. You know, literally, look, I've given everything up. I've given my standing up to have a relationship with you so we can be together, so you don't lose everything. So what does Rembrandt do? He tries to get her put into an asylum so he could have his relations with the 17-year-old. Yeah. No. It makes it. Yeah, absolutely. I don't think he did. I don't think he did. And then throughout his life, he lost everything because he started to stop painting portraits. He got bored of painting portraits, which he was famous for, and he wanted to paint history scenes. However, nobody liked his history scenes as much, and he didn't have as much money, so he lost everything. He painted almost every few years. He painted a self-portrait. So this is kind of Mr. Arrogant. And in his last one, not the year before he died, he's kind of accepted what his lot in life is now. He's actually, you know, this is him. He's made quite a few mistakes, some of them large, and down to him. You know, it was his choice to give up portraiture, and it was his choice to try and chase women, you know, much younger than him. And
children survive.
You know what? I don't know. Yeah. So it's fascinating, isn't it?
So really, so he was able then to sell the house, was he?
I think he was in a lot of debt. So he was having to take loans out to pay off loans, and, you know, he really wasn't able. And I think he didn't live within his means either.
Why didn't do so much painting?
Yes, I mean, he did 100 renderings of himself. Yeah, 40 paintings, 30 etchings, and a handful of drawings. But they did. What's interesting is if you look at them all and line them up, you can. It's a chronicle of his life, of how he starts big and then goes down, and then he dies penniless. Well, highly possible. You know, you can. You know, you see him with this little nightcap. Some paintings, as he gets older, you see him with his actual palette and things as an artist. But here he's just an old man with his wrinkles and his grey hair.
How old was he when he died?
He was quite old, Rembrandt. He was in his 60s. Yeah, he was born in 1606, died 1669. So in his 60s.
He did Strictly and
it will. You'll just shout it out in the middle of the night. You know, huge financial losses, huge stress, and you can see it all. He does look like a little. 4 children. Only 1 survived. Thank you. No living descendants of Rembrandt. Yes. Yes, he does. Yes. Yes, age 63. In the months leading up to his death, he did 4 self-portraits. I suppose to show him as he really was, warts and all, because it's his way of accepting death and accepting all of his problems, really. Well, yeah, there is a bit of that, isn't there? Absolutely. Absolutely. We'll have a quick look. So it is quite tragic in a way, and this is Judith Lester, or Leicester. And she was quite a famous Dutch Golden Age painter of portraits, genre works, and still lifes. Her work was really highly regarded by contemporaries, but almost not long after she died, she became totally forgotten. Now, her entire body of work became attributed to Frans Hals, Laughing Cavalier guy, because they trained under the same tutor, and their painting style was very, very similar. Very similar. Other parts of her work were attributed to her husband, who was also a painter, but she was most closely in style to Frans Hals. And how she was rediscovered was in the 1940s. A man bought what he believed to be a Frans Hals painting for a good sum of money, and then it was discovered. They found her signature, and she used to do it with her surname is a play on the North Star, and she would sign it as a star with something else, and they found this on it, and they realised it was by Judith. The painting immediately devalued massively because it's by a woman, but then it started everybody looking for her work. There were a lot of problems with her and Frans Hals. Frans Hals kind of stole some of her students, and then there was court, and there was a lot going on, a lot of rivalry and competition, because she had a school of art and she was training people. Now, to do that, you had to be part of the guild. Remember doing the Dutch Masters, where you had to be part of the guild? So the only way an artist could paint to sell their work and to teach would be to become a guild member. If you were not a guild member, you couldn't sell your work. You could paint, but that was it. And she was a guild member, and she was very good and highly thought of. So it's so sad that very suddenly after she died, she was quickly forgotten, and attributed to Frans Hals largely. Because her signature wasn't necessarily a signature as such, it was more of an emblem. So maybe people didn't think of it. Or sometimes unscrupulous art dealers might smudge a bit of paint over that signature and go, well, it looks like an unsigned Frans Hals. I mean, I was once asked by an antique dealer many years ago in my 20s, if I brought in an old wooden panel, could you paint it like Monet but not sign it? I didn't. Because they would have gone, oh, well, it could be a Monet, we're not sure, that's why we're only selling it for this much, and you take a punt on it. I wasn't prepared, and wouldn't even be in an auction house. And I almost got done myself locally at an antique place. There was a painting by a female artist, Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, and it was her painting Marie Antoinette. And on the Wednesday night, I'd done an art history lecture on her and that painting. And then on the Sunday, I'd gone to the Antique Centre and saw that painting. Now, I knew where it was. It was in a National Trust property in the south of England. And it wasn't signed. And it was beautifully painted, but nowhere near. Because she did paint copies of her own work to sell on. So she reproduced her own work. And I said, oh, what can you tell me about this painting? And they said, oh, well, we think it's by an Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, but we can't actually be sure. Now, I knew it wasn't, but I didn't want to let on that I knew it wasn't. It was only 200 quid, and it was a beautiful oil painting, but it's that sort of questionable stuff. So you can see how easily it happens. But sad that somebody so well regarded in the art world was just suddenly wiped out, painted out. Yeah, absolutely. Here is Angelica Kaufmann. Beautiful. Now, in the 18th century, she is one of the female artists deemed equal to her male counterparts. Swiss-born. one of the only female founding members of the British Royal Academy. I mean, their acceptance of into the Academy was kind of a token gesture, really. But they're now just portraits on a wall, really, as founder members of the Royal Academy. But she was a renowned artist by the time she died, and her funeral was directed by the well-known neoclassical sculptor Antonio Canova, and he designed her funeral based on the funeral of Renaissance master Raphael. So they gave her a very big, high, arty send-off. What a beautiful self-portrait that is, though. She looks quite timid. I bet she wasn't, but she looks quite timid and gazing right at us. Yeah, beautiful skin tones, and the way the hand is done, gorgeous. Again, yes, skillful as well, look, because she's got both hands in view, and one of them's on a book. So I would imagine she would have had to have another model to do that, because there's no way you could keep sketching and then pick up a book every single time to get that effect. It's beautiful though, isn't it? It's very much of its time. I'm going to whistle through some more. That little ringlet there on her neck. Oh, do you know what? I never enlarged the screen for you, did I? There we go. You can see it bigger. And then we have Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun. She actually caused a scandal with this portrait. She was also known as Madame Lebrun, by the way, and she was a portrait painter, mainly of women in the late 18th century. We're looking at sort of a neoclassical style at the aftermath of the Rococo period. But, yeah, in 1787, she caused a scandal with the self-portrait, where she was smiling open-mouthed. Now, that was not done for women in portraiture. It was considered a massive contravention in painting conventions. Going right back to antiquity, women always had their mouths shut, and she did not. Absolutely. She would have been well aware of the conventions of that, but no, she wanted to show herself slightly open-mouthed, far too sexual, of course. Oh, that's fine, but you can't open your mouth. It's crazy, isn't it? What a crazy world it is. And it's not much better. But do you know what? I absolutely love that ostrich feather in her hat. It feels like it's like floppy, you know, you could almost feel it moving around. And there she is showing herself as an artist. Yeah, absolutely. But the way the hat is shading the face, it's just so beautiful. Oh, absolutely. I think, you know, she knew a lot of people, and she was extremely well known and well respected in France at the time. Beautiful portrait, isn't it? Absolutely. And again, that porcelain skin tone. Absolutely beautiful. No. Well, that was the sign of wealth and sort of the paler the skin, the better. You weren't toiling in the farms. And now it's the opposite, isn't it? Whereas the wealthy are highly tanned because all they can do is go and holiday. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. So here, this is what we started with in terms of the main image for the theme. Self-portrait titled The Desperate Man. And this is his most well-known self-portrait, completed in 1845. What was desperate? Absolutely. Is it needing money? Is it needing fame? Is he just struggling to get it right? And he's just the more he's you can do it in class. The more you're painting, the less, and you're getting more stressed and tearing your hair out. And but how hard to do? Because this is still before photography, really. Absolutely, because he's got what, one hand through his hair there, hasn't he, and one hand, and actually looping through. Yeah, because that finger is through his hair. So how clever! Just is it like which the one that's on the top? No, the one like there. No, can you see? Look, if I really tense my hand, I think it's sort of part of the muscle of the palm. Yeah, but if you look, if I really tense that, it's kind of, there's a lot of lines, and because of the lighting, like this lump here is quite pronounced, isn't it, on his little finger? So with the right lighting, there's a bit of dark there, that dimples in, and then you've got this area that comes out. And it is really dramatic lighting. It's a beautiful self-portrait, though. It's a beautiful painting of a face, regardless of being self-portrait. And it is quite iconic, but you wouldn't think of it as a self-portrait. It does. Russell Brand crossed with Rossetti. It's fascinating, though, isn't it? And he's got his eyes wide open. And that is the frustration. So I do wonder if it is that the desperate man is that he couldn't get the portrait looking right. And he's like, you know, that sort of... And in the process of, like, scribbling over it or knifing through the canvas or screwing the paper up. Yeah, he is. He's got his apron on and, you know, his shirt sleeves rolled up slightly. Yes. And they've got, and that one has got a collar on it, whereas some of them wouldn't have had a collar. They'd be button collars on top. No, that could be anybody at any time, couldn't it? Really. Actually, if I now took a photograph of me like that and rolled my sleeves up and took my shirt off, not my shirt off, took my tie off, you know, it would have that look, especially because long hair's back in and facial hair's back in. Yeah, it's amazing, but he is very Russell Brand actually in terms of face shape. Or I used to love Rent-A-Ghost when I was a kid, and he looks like Timothy Claypole, the jester. Remember him? He looks just like him actually. Yeah. Because there is no indication of the era really, other than the date. You know, you don't know when that is. There's no hint in the background, nothing at all. I just think it's really fascinating. And what again, when we started, we were saying about how artists want to be portrayed. This is how he wanted to be portrayed, as a desperate man. I mean, in a way, it's worked because, you know, 2023, we're still talking about him. I love it.
It's more natural.
It is, absolutely, and it's slightly comical, but also, you know, you could make it earlier as well with that almost Shakespearean in that look. You know, especially with the little goatee and all of that, it could be Elizabethan without his ruff. Yes, like a big Caravaggio theatrical piece. Because again, he's chosen not to fit himself in. His elbows out, both elbows really, are off out of the picture. And also, it's in landscape, not portrait. And you know, that's what you have to think. He could have had the canvas in portrait.
Plus, it doesn't belong to the museum.
It's a private.
Sometimes they get out for Paris. It wasn't. It hasn't been displayed in Paris, but it actually belongs to.
Yeah, private collection. It is cracking, isn't it? It's a cracking piece. Now, when you get your hand out, I've made a mistake that I've started talking about Van Gogh, but then got excited and shoved another artist in the middle. Okay, so I'm ignoring the bit about Van Gogh for a minute, and I'm going to talk about Arnold Böcklin. We have looked at him before when we did symbolism, I think. He's the man that he lost his daughter at a very young age, and he painted a very mysterious island with a boat sailing towards it with a black figure on the boat. It's very spooky, and I think it's symbolism. So this is quite a morbid piece in a way, because you've got the legacy of an artist in the fact that you've got this chilling figure of death standing behind him playing a fiddle with only one string. Obviously the painter is listening to this otherworldly tune, and the skeleton represents what is known as a memento mori, which is a remember death, a memory of death. And it's often used in art, all the time, it's that transient feel of life, no matter what happens, we're all going to die, whether you're intelligent or stupid or wealthy or poor, your grave will still be the same size, kind of thing. And it's kind of, and we saw that with the Dutch portrait, with the Dutch still lives, didn't we? Because the still lives are all dying. As soon as a flower is picked, it is dying. And it had often butterflies in there that had very short lifespans. And there's a lot, a lot of all of this thing, sometimes a vanitas and sometimes that kind of thing where at the end of it all, that is the... Absolutely. But what's interesting is he's quite defiant and accepting. He's not frightened that death is playing that fiddle. It's going to be quite a boring tune with only one note. He does, but also how fragile does death look compared to Böcklin, who's quite sturdy and, But he knows that when the artists die, his work will live on to mark his passing from the planet. So it's kind of, I know that death is there, but my art will live on. I wonder if mine will. I wonder if I pop my clogs, everybody will just bust out my £5 paintings from the thing and try to sell them for 30 quid. Do you know, I would be really annoyed. And if I could come back, I would be really annoyed and haunt people. Because how annoying. I started painting professionally when I was 15, so we're looking at 30 years nearly. I've tried hard just to make, every time, Jackie gets bored of it and I'll say, this is it, this is the one thing that I'm going to do and it's going to do well, and it plummets and it does nothing. And then if I die, the minute I die, I will be haunting people. I will, if I do... I know, and I think, that's why I haven't got children, because I'm damned if they're going to benefit from my death. If I haven't got anything, they're not either. So yeah, it's interesting, but he's there as a painter, isn't it? And look how beautiful that hand with the brush is. It is a gorgeous painting. Determined. Yeah, and I think he's a bit maudlin. He's gone through a lot,
Cheer him up.
Yeah. Maybe he would be a better lass after a couple of pints. Yeah, I think his daughter died very young, I believe. Let's have a look. A challenge.
Cheer him up. Join him up a bit.
His first fiance died young. The second woman trying to marry him after his wife died. Then he married 70 and had 14 children.
How many?
14. 5 died in childhood and another 3 died before he
Yeah, so yeah, there's a lot of death in his life.
On his mind.
I think. Do you know what? I think it never does leave it. I mean, like with even with me having lost a lot of my family and my parents, both parents before I was 30. No.
Yes.
No, both parents before I was 40. I mean, I lost my father at 19 and my mum in my 30s. Death is on your mind more, but not in a bad way. You're just more conscious of the fact that you will die. I mean, I do. It's quite morbid. I do feel that sometimes. I know I'm going to die. I don't know when, which is why I try to cram as much in that I can and make a difference to people's lives and make the most of it. You know, May has been an amazing month. I've been in Melton Mowbray singing. I've been in a pub singing. I've been teaching classes. I've been, all sorts of things. I had a wonderful walk at Blue Bellwood. Enjoying everything because you never know. And I think these kind of memento moris do serve to show that you just don't know. So you might as well enjoy whatever time you've got. What is the point? I mean, as a massive overthinker, I know there is no point in worrying that I've got no money, because if I worry about it, I still won't have any more money. Exactly, and that is it, isn't it? It's about living in the now, which I never do. It is absolutely, because while I'm here now, the good thing about why I teach is because while I'm teaching, I am in the present. But as soon as I'm not, I'm thinking this about tomorrow or about last week, and I'm very rarely in the present. Yeah. And it's a nice. He looks like a nice. He does look like a nice chap in a way. So yeah, I just thought that was a really interesting one. Now, let's have. Vincent. We'll look at. This is his famous one. So actually, Vincent. I call him Van Gogh a lot, and I really hate it. He should be called Vincent, because that's how he signed his work, and that's how an artist wants to be known in the world, if by their signature. So I'm going to call him Vincent. Yeah, and it should be Van or something like that. No, so. And on all of his paintings, he signs it Vincent. So we'll call him Vincent. So he created more than 43 self-portraits between 1885 and 1889 in a very short. So that's what 4 years. 43 portraits in 4 years. They were in a series, and they continued right up until he died. The portraits were studies where he was reluctant to mix with others at times, so he couldn't get anyone to sit because he didn't want it. He didn't want to talk to anyone. He'd only got himself in a mirror. So you've got the urge. It's hard, isn't it? If you've got the urge to paint a portrait and you've got no friends and you don't want to make any, the only thing you've got is your mirror. He is absolutely, and even with the broad brushstrokes, it makes sense because the brushstrokes follow the planes and the contours. They do vary stylistically with what he does. You've either got strong contrasts, strong brushstrokes. This one, this way it's almost like an explosion where the paint is spreading outwards from the centre. Very rhythmic brushstrokes, very organised, very orderly. and almost a halo around him. And this was a purposeful canvas. You see here, often in his self-portraits, his mental health is evident in how he's either unkempt or, the several portraits of him with his bandage on his ear when he chopped part of his lobe off. In very few do you actually see Van Gogh depicted as a painter. It's nearly all just head and shoulders. You don't see anything else with him. Sometimes you see him from the right, sometimes you see him from the left, which is quite fascinating, really. Yeah. You see, this is fascinating. I really kind of like this one, but you can see here, this is 1887, and the other one was... 1887, yeah. So, but he looks sunken more in this one, doesn't he? Because you can see the brushstrokes are finer and smaller, whereas the broader brushstrokes don't portray the shape face in the same way. I do like this one. He looks a bit like Bing Crosby in this, but a ginger Bing Crosby. He does look fed up. The eyes are haunting because they're dead. There's no sparkle. There is no light behind those eyes. Is there in that one? There is in that one. So he's feeling happier, but maybe the brushstrokes indicate that, whereas this one is more methodical and slow and, it's not rushed, so it's not like he's given up painting, but he's given up on himself, maybe. He does look quite bitter. Yeah. But when you think of Vincent's life, it was quite traumatic, really, because even as the minute he was born, because his father was a pastor in the church, so every week he had to go to church. He had to pass the gravestone of his brother who was born a year before of him, called Vincent van Gogh. So he had to pass a gravestone with his own name on it, and also knowing that he was named after his dead brother, a replacement. It's going to affect you from a young age, isn't it? All of that kind of stuff. He was a very compassionate man. We know he was a compassionate man because he got sacked from nearly all of the jobs he had. He collected school fees in London, but from the poor neighbourhoods, and he often just used to let them off because he used to feel really sorry for them, which is kind of not what the purpose of collecting fees are for. He became a preacher, and he had to stop because he was too zealous. So he's just a very passionate man with a lot of empathy, I think. You do, and you absorb, absolutely. He would absorb it all. Yeah. Now this one you may not have seen is Monet. Now, Jackie, do you not think he looks like Tom Wilde? Tom B. Wilde Esquire? The guy with his guitar, the vintage guy. He did that song "I've No More F's to Give" that went viral. You don't know him? Hang on, I can show for the benefit. Yeah, don't look up that song, but it's a good song. I'll just see if I can find him. Now, I've just found one of him. It looks just like him.
I might have to send him.
So this, he often wore the beret, and he had that big beard. He was known for this. It's painted in 1886. And it shows his blurred brushstrokes in a way, but how different in style is it compared to Vincent's work? This is more of a hurried style, a very free style, whereas although Vincent's work is loose, it is very contained. It's not wild, is it? It's very purposeful compared to something like that. Yes. And this is a private in private collection, but it does show really well light and dark. So here you can see the dark side of his face, the background is lighter, and the light side of his face, the background is slightly darker. So that's a bit of chiaroscuro. I'm going to whiz through some more. They're beautiful, aren't they? To say they're loosely painted, they're really well done. Now this one is a Gauguin. Yeah. He looks very quizzical, doesn't he? A beautiful, colourful palette. Now, he did over 40 self-portraits, but this is his most well-known because it's just random. But you've got apples and a snake, so it's religious, isn't it? And he's given himself a halo. So, yes, he's made him saintly or holy. The apple, although the apple on the tree, it hasn't been bitten, so maybe he felt he wasn't sinful. And he's actually holding the serpent. So yeah, interesting, isn't it? But I wouldn't have said he looked like that. He looks like some sort of medieval knight. Or Terry Thomas. Yes! Yeah, there is, isn't there, though? There is. He's got that very, that face and the hairstyle and everything. But how much, obviously with something like this, how much would he be recognisable? So from there, we'll have a quick look at Cézanne. So although he was famous for his, Cubist landscapes and stuff, this one, he did paint a lot of portraits. It's quite nice, but you can see that the way he's used colour again. You've got that chiaroscuro, it's lighter where it's darker. You've got that play against light against dark. Yeah, absolutely. He's stuffed himself in that canvas. And again, a very different style to Monet. So although we've got Impressionists, it's absolutely, I mean, it's basically black, white, ochre and ultramarine, I would say, and that gives you all of those colours. And a bit crimson. It's fascinating to see them, isn't it, again? Now, we would know there would be photographs of these artists about, because we're in the realms of photography. Absolutely. Edvard Munch, the Scream. No, absolutely. So Norwegian painter Edvard Munch, known for the very expressionist, strange stuff. So this is a self-portrait with skeleton arm. Can you spot the skeleton arm at the front, at the bottom? So it blended in lithographic chalk and ink. And he often blacked out the skeleton arm and his signature. But this is an authentic one in the British Museum. I don't know. Death, yes, a memento mori. Yeah. So it was always on his mind. Which I find it, which it would. 1895. No, he would. Yeah. Yes, a floating head. Maybe that's how he saw his thoughts as well. There was just disembodied, and maybe he feels disembodied at times because the arm isn't attached to him either. It can't be his arm. Yeah, Memento Mori. So this is a Picasso, 1906. Not massively. I mean, he did a lot of self-portraits, but obviously with his sort of experimentation and reinvention all the time, he was a classically trained painter. But if you're a portrait painter and the arrival of photography starts taking over, you're going to have to change tack, aren't you? So that's what he did. He reinvented himself, and fortunately, he was at the time when the art world was changing drastically anyway. And it's a bit like I saw a digital artist yesterday. I was talking to Jackie about it. I saw a digital artist yesterday. He made a digital art to say how there was no joy in AI art. However, I nearly commented and said, I'm old enough to remember that artists said this about digital art, and actually artists said it about photography because they're frightened of it replacing them. And I said it is never replaced, it's symbiotic. You know, artists now use photography to help them, and artists now use digital art to help them. So I don't think it'll be a replacement for fine art, but it's just ironic that he chose to do a digital piece because he was young. And I just thought, yeah, because you don't remember life before digital. But I'll show you, and I've got here. Yes. Yeah, like the iPad. Yeah, the Kindle would replace books. Absolutely. And look at the vinyl records. Cassette tapes are coming back. Yeah. So this is a self-portrait from 1896 of Picasso. So he could do it. 1906. So 10 years. He's decided to... No. But it's kind of... He's changed exactly his style, his colour palette. He started going to Cubism and all of that kind of stuff. Very few self-portraits are known to exist after 1907 of Picasso. He did do a few images of himself in crayon on pencil in 1972. One of them, which I haven't got, is the self-portrait facing death. And that's possibly the most realistic of all, where he's looking tired and vulnerable and you know, about to meet his maker. So this just shows, when people go, well, Picasso couldn't paint, that's why he did this. He actually could. His father was an amazing still life painter and trained him. He did the most beautiful pastel portraits in his youth. He really was amazing. Absolutely. Exactly. It's a bit like Les Dennis being able to play the piano badly. You can't play it badly until you learn how to play. And actually, that's what Picasso said. He famously said, you need to learn the rules like an artist to break them like a professional, or something like that. Whiz through a few more. Tamara de Lempisca. She was famously quoted as saying, among 100 paintings you could recognise mine. My goal was, do not copy, create a new style. Colours light and bright, return to elegance in my models. So this is called My Portrait, or Tamara in a green Bugatti. Isn't it? She was synonymous of the 20s. She was a proper it girl, really. She was Polish, spent her working life in France and America, known for her really wonderful Art Deco portraits of aristocrats and wealthy people, very stylised nudes. Born in Warsaw, moved to St. Petersburg, where she married Mr. Lempisky, a Polish lawyer, then travelled to Paris, studied painting with Maurice Denis and André Lot, and, you know, a bit of a blend of Cubism, neoclassical style, really made her famous. An active participant in the aristocratic social life, so she was an it girl. She became the mistress of Baron Raoul Kuffner, a wealthy art collector for the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, as a way of forwarding her career. She then divorced Lempisky in 1931, and then Kuffner married Lempiska, and then she became known in the press as the Baroness with a Brush. Following the outbreak of World War II, she and her husband moved to America, and she painted celebrity portraits, still lifes, and some abstract in the 60s. Her work fell out of fashion after World War II, but made a comeback in the late 60s with the rediscovery of Art Deco. She moved to Mexico in 1974, and she died in 1980. And her ashes were scattered over one of the volcanoes in her hometown. She was, and she was quite scandalous in her time, because she wasn't choosy of whatever gender she would see. So she just enjoyed her life. It's beautiful. It's a gorgeous portrait, but you can see that cubist element as well as the Art Deco element. Right, we've got to whistle through a few more. I love it. It's one of my favourite. I love her work, though. Now, you may not like this one. It's a Salvador Dali. Self-portrait with grilled bacon. And there's the bacon. Would you expect anything else? Rather unusual and original. Comedy, a soft melted. I've no idea. Just because he could. And you've got like this melted face that looks like he's been peeled off his skull and just stuck on those spikes. Yeah. And it's that blurring the barrier between reality and imagination in quite a dark and haunting way, really, as a surrealist. I suppose the grilled bacon is a sign of sort of biological matter, that kind of thing. But he also used to like eating it for breakfast. So, interesting self-portrait there. This woman needs no introduction. Frida Kahlo. She did lots of self-portraits in her life, but she also used self-portraiture to communicate her suffering and her thoughts. She did one where I've forgotten the name of her partner. He had an affair, and she painted him as her third eye. Yeah, so it was almost as if he was always on her mind, in her head, that kind of thing. I mean, she had a life of chronic pain because she was a victim of a near-fatal bus accident at age 18. So she had a lot of anguish. She has a massive resurgence the last few years. Yeah, Frida Kahlo, she's like one of the big boss girls. That's the thing, girl boss. A girl boss. She was quite strong, powerful, and despite what she went through, she was there and turned up. So yeah, quite iconic as a self-portrait. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to show you 4 very quickly. It'd be nice to finish off the years. Here we have Lucian Freud. Reflection with 2 children. They are his children. But look how giant he's made himself. He dwarfs his children. Very alienated as well, though, because they're not looking up at him. No, and the colour palette's quite morbid, isn't it? And dull and depressing, cold. And he looks quite monstrous, looming over them in a way, very Hansel and Gretel-like. Yeah. And it painted the ceiling as if it surrounds him, because we're looking up at him, because that's the ceiling light to the right, isn't it? Yeah. And he's got that intense gaze to us. And obviously this is how he wants to be seen. Fascinating. 2 more, I think. Andy Warhol. Now, he used to say that he made portraits to remind himself that he's still around. So, you know, in a typical way, but you've got that juxtaposition of several angles of self-portrait. Yeah, that's true. Very a disembodied head. And I think this is, in 78, this would be him also being aware of his mortality. This floating head, no matter, you know, how we fashion ourselves and what we do. Oh, I don't know. When did that happen?
Still see it's him though.
You can still see it's him. You can indeed.
I've got. I think it's very slow. It's not doing anything.
He's 68.
Oh, 68. There you go.
Yeah, so that would make him more aware. Absolutely. But you can still tell it's him. And in a way, it's a bit cubist because you've got 4 portraits and 4 different angles, which cubism was about multifaceted things. Right, 2 more and then we'll stop. So here we have Norman Rockwell. And again, this is almost a nod. Remember that one that we looked at? What was his name? Johannes Gump. So you can see how that was done. And it's really, you know, this is an oil painting. But isn't it lovely? There's a funness to this one. Absolutely, it's almost cartoon-like. But then the portrait isn't a cartoon, and there's realism to it, but also it feels fun. It's one of my favourites. I just love this one. And then lastly, Hockney. Yes. And he's very ruthless, actually, because he never poses. He doesn't do anything formal. It's just him. What he looks like at that time, what he sees. Quite awkward in a way. And the way he's chosen this, you know, it's an honest observation. He invited friends to Los Angeles at his studio, where he painted a series of full-length single and double portraits. He worked directly onto the canvas without photographic reference or preparatory drawing. And this self-portrait was in that series, where the New York-based curator Charlie Sheeps is in the background. Which is almost going back to how they did it at the beginning, you know, straight directly on there, from the vision, paint what you see, nothing preliminary beforehand. So, I mean, I know we've whizzed through 30 portraits, but we've got, I mean, right back to, what, 1353 BC, with the Egyptian sculpture self-portrait. Which one stands out in your mind? Is there a portrait that stands out in your mind? Yeah, but you did like the Courbet one, didn't you? You like that one, but then you also had a thing for him. But I think you just had a thing for him. It is, and they're all so different, but it's really interesting. Tamara.
Oh, yeah. And also the what's her name? The lady that got attacked.
Artemisia Gentileschi. Yeah. So next month. Caspar David Friedrich, one of my favourite painters. So I hope you've enjoyed this. And it's just interesting to see how artists see themselves and want to be remembered. Absolutely, that's the idea. Because if I grew up with the history of art by Gombrich, which was very, very structured and nearly all male dominated, and then every other art history book is linked to that. You only ever see the same things on the cycle by the same artists. But I try to show you, even if you know the artist, I try to find you something that you won't be familiar with, just to expand your horizons a little bit. Yeah, and it's purely because they get the name out there because of just recycling the same stuff over again. So I know Liz, Christine, and Janet, you'll be watching this on catch up. So I hope you've enjoyed this too. So take care, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye, everybody. Bye bye. Yeah, it's recorded